"You're about to watch a man destroy his own orchard," someone shouted from across the dusty county road. And within seconds, nearly every phone pointed toward Marcus Reed instead of the peach trees. Laughter rolled across the hillside as if it had been rehearsed. A white pickup slowed to a stop beside the split-rail fence, then another, and another, until a line of curious neighbors stretched along the gravel shoulder. Marcus dipped his wide brush into a 5-gallon bucket, lifted it carefully, and spread another smooth coat of white across the trunk of the last mature peach tree in his small orchard. The fresh paint glowed beneath the bright Georgia sun, making the old bark almost shine. He finally lost it. Ethan Walker called out with a grin that drew instant laughter from the crowd. Ethan owned the largest peach operation in the county, nearly 400 acres of perfectly ordered trees that seemed to stretch forever beyond the rolling hills. People trusted his opinion because his harvests filled grocery stores across 3 states. If Ethan laughed at something, everyone else usually followed. Marcus never looked up. His faded work gloves were stained white around the fingertips, and sweat rolled down the side of his face before disappearing into the collar of his worn denim shirt. He simply dipped the brush again and continued covering the bark with slow, even strokes. Every movement was deliberate, patient, almost peaceful. Behind the porch screen, 8-year-old Lily Reed peeked outside with nervous eyes, hugging a stuffed rabbit that had belonged to her mother. She watched another truck stop beside the road. Someone leaned out the passenger window and recorded Marcus while laughing loud enough for her to hear every word. "Poor kid," one woman whispered to another. "She deserves better than watching her daddy ruin the only thing he has left." Lily lowered her eyes, pretending not to hear, but the words settled heavily inside her chest. Marcus finally rinsed the brush in a bucket of water before reaching for another gallon of white coating stacked beside the fence. A teenage boy shouted, "Hey, Marcus, you planning to paint the peaches next?" More laughter erupted. Several people clapped sarcastically. One man joked that Marcus should start taking landscaping advice from kindergarten art students. Phones kept recording. Comments were already pouring onto local social media pages before Marcus even sealed the paint bucket. The clips spread from neighbor to neighbor with captions calling him crazy, desperate, and clueless. Yet Marcus never answered a single insult. Instead, he walked toward an old wooden shed tucked beneath a pair of towering oak trees. Inside, sunlight filtered through dusty windows onto a weathered workbench where a faded leather notebook rested beneath a folded shop towel. Marcus lifted it gently, almost reverently, and brushed away a thin layer of dust. Across the worn cover, barely visible after decades of use, were the initials HR, his late father's handwriting pressed into the cracked leather. Marcus opened the notebook to a page covered with careful sketches of peach trunks, handwritten temperature notes, and one sentence underlined twice in blue ink. "Protect the bark before the weather turns against you." Outside, the laughter continued, louder than ever, but Marcus quietly ran his fingers across the faded words, closed the notebook, and looked toward the cloudless sky, knowing something the rest of the county had not yet begun to see. Marcus had learned a long time ago that the loudest voices in a small town usually disappeared when the seasons changed, but the land always remembered who had cared for it. After placing his father's notebook back on the workbench, he stepped outside and closed the shed door behind him. The afternoon air carried the sweet scent of freshly turned soil, mixed with the sharp smell of white tree coating drying beneath the warm Georgia sun. Across the fence, the last of the spectators finally climbed into their trucks, still laughing as gravel sprayed beneath spinning tires. Their voices faded down the county road, but their recordings did not. By dinner, Marcus's face had spread across local social media pages. Strangers called him foolish. Others claimed grief had clouded his judgment after losing his wife 3 years earlier. Some insisted his daughter deserved to live with relatives who knew how to run a farm. Marcus never opened a single comment. Instead, he washed the paint from his hands, filled an old metal watering can, and walked slowly between every row of peach trees. Lily followed close behind, carrying a small bucket almost too heavy for her. She tried to smile the way her father always did, but her eyes kept drifting toward the road every time another vehicle passed. Finally, she asked the question she had been holding inside all afternoon. "Daddy, what if everyone is right?" Marcus stopped beside the oldest tree in the orchard, its wide trunk marked by decades of careful pruning. He rested one hand against the cool white surface before looking down at his daughter. "Do you remember what Grandpa always said about farming?" Lily thought quietly before shaking her head. Marcus smiled gently. He said trees do not listen to opinions. They only respond to care. Lily looked back at the orchard stretching across the gentle hillside. Nearly 6 acres. It was not much compared to Ethan Walker's hundreds of acres, but every tree carried a story. Marcus had climbed many of them as a boy while his father taught him how to read bark, watch the weather, and respect the land instead of trying to control it. Those lessons became even more important after his wife, Angela, passed away. He had sold nearly everything except the farmhouse and the orchard because he promised Lily they would never lose the place where her mother planted wildflowers along the fence every spring. Since then, every sunrise had begun the same way. Marcus prepared breakfast before daylight, packed Lily's school lunch, drove her 15 miles into town, then returned to prune branches, repair irrigation lines, and study the weather reports each evening. He was not trying to become the richest grower in Georgia. He was simply trying to keep one family's legacy alive. As sunset painted the sky with soft shades of orange and pink, Marcus unfolded the weather charts inside his father's notebook once more. A series of handwritten dates caught his attention beside an old newspaper clipping about an unusual spring temperature swing. His father had circled one sentence in thick blue ink years ago. "The danger rarely comes from the cold you expect. It comes from the heat that arrives too early." Marcus slowly lifted his eyes toward the horizon where an unusual shimmer danced above the distant fields. The breeze that should have cooled the evening never arrived. And somewhere beyond Ethan Walker's sprawling orchard, the first warning signs of a season unlike any the county had ever seen were already beginning to take shape. 3 days later, the county felt strangely restless. The mornings arrived warmer than they should have, and even the old-timers sitting outside Miller's General Store admitted they had never seen April begin quite like this. By noon, the air shimmered above the roads, and the sunlight pressed against every field with unusual intensity. Marcus noticed it immediately. The bark on untreated peach trees across neighboring orchards had already begun absorbing more heat than normal. He knelt beside one of his own painted trunks and rested the back of his hand against the white surface. It remained noticeably cooler. He did not smile. He simply wrote another observation inside his father's notebook before slipping it back into his shirt pocket. Across the valley, Ethan Walker drove through his massive orchard in a spotless utility vehicle, stopping every few hundred feet to inspect rows that seemed endless beneath the bright sky. His workers followed carefully behind, checking irrigation lines and adjusting sprinklers. Everything appeared perfect. Healthy leaves shimmered in the afternoon light, and thousands of tiny peaches had already begun forming on the branches. Ethan looked across the fence toward Marcus's modest orchard and shook his head with quiet amusement. "Still looks ridiculous," he muttered to one of his supervisors. "People spend their lives learning how to grow fruit, and some folks think one old notebook makes them experts." The supervisor laughed politely, eager to agree. News crews never came to small farming towns unless something unusual happened, but local interest in Marcus had not faded. More cars slowed along the road each afternoon. Some people took new pictures, hoping to catch the moment the trees began failing. Others simply wanted proof that the strange white trunks were still standing. Lily noticed every glance whenever she returned home from school. One afternoon, she climbed onto the porch beside her father while he repaired an old wooden crate for the coming harvest. "Nobody laughed today," she said quietly. Marcus looked up. "That is good." She hesitated before adding, "They just kept staring." Marcus placed another nail carefully into the weathered board. Sometimes people stop laughing when they cannot explain what they are seeing. Before Lily could answer, a pickup truck rolled slowly into the gravel driveway. Grace Turner stepped out carrying a homemade peach pie wrapped in a checkered towel. She had lived 2 farms away for nearly 20 years and was one of the few neighbors who had never joined the laughter. "I figured you both could use some company," she said with a warm smile. Marcus thanked her as they sat together beneath the shade of an old pecan tree. Grace glanced toward the orchard. "I do not know if your father was right," she admitted honestly. "But I know Henry Reed never wrote anything without testing it first." Marcus nodded. "Neither did I." As the afternoon drifted toward evening, a weather alert crackled across Grace's portable radio. Meteorologists warned of record-breaking temperatures arriving within 48 hours, followed by the possibility of an unusually strong cold front before the end of the week. Grace slowly lowered the radio. Marcus looked toward his painted orchard without saying a word. Across the valley, Ethan's workers continued moving confidently through endless rows of dark tree trunks, unaware that the season everyone thought they understood was about to rewrite every rule they had trusted for decades. The heat arrived exactly as the weather alert predicted, but no forecast captured how relentless it would feel. By 10 o'clock each morning, waves of shimmering air floated above the orchards, and the soil beneath every boot seemed to release the warmth it had stored overnight. Birds that normally filled the trees with cheerful songs disappeared into the shade, and even the wind felt strangely tired. Marcus began walking the orchard before sunrise and again just before sunset, checking every trunk, every branch, every young peach. The painted bark remained noticeably cooler beneath his fingertips, just as his father's notebook had described decades earlier. Still, Marcus refused to celebrate. Nature had not finished writing this season's story. Across the valley, Ethan Walker gathered several neighboring growers beneath the equipment shed near his packing house. Large ceiling fans spun overhead while maps and weather reports covered a folding table. Everyone agreed that irrigation would be enough. They had survived difficult springs before, and experience gave them confidence. When someone casually mentioned Marcus and his unusual orchard, the room filled with quiet chuckles. Ethan folded his arms and smiled. If white paint could save peach trees, he said, every university would have been teaching it for years. Heads nodded around the table. Nobody questioned him. Confidence was comforting, especially when uncertainty stood just outside the door. Meanwhile, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. A representative from the local agricultural bank parked beside the farmhouse late that afternoon, carrying a clipboard and several folders. His tone remained polite, but his message was clear. Because Marcus had struggled financially since Angela passed away, the bank wanted reassurance that this year's crop would support the remaining farm loan. The representative glanced toward the painted orchard before looking back at Marcus. Some people in town are worried, he admitted carefully. They think your methods may reduce the value of the property if the harvest fails. Marcus listened without interrupting. Then he quietly replied, "The land will answer that question better than I can." The representative nodded respectfully, although uncertainty lingered in his eyes. After he drove away, Lily sat beside her father on the porch steps as the evening sky slowly softened into deep shades of gold. She watched him studying the weather charts again. "Are you scared?" she asked. Marcus remained silent for a long moment, before answering honestly. "Every farmer is scared before harvest. The difference is whether fear makes you forget what you know." Lily leaned gently against his shoulder. Neither of them noticed the first cool breeze arriving from the north. It felt almost pleasant after days of intense heat, but Marcus looked up immediately. His expression changed. He remembered another sentence from his father's notebook, one he had read so many times he no longer needed to open the page. Heat weakens the bark. Sudden cold finishes the damage. He stood without another word and walked toward the orchard as the last sunlight faded behind the hills. Above the valley, dark clouds quietly gathered along the horizon, and for the first time all week, the evening air carried a chill that did not belong to spring. The cold front arrived just before dawn with almost no warning. Marcus woke to the sound of branches whispering beneath a steady northern wind that had not existed the night before. He pulled on his work boots, stepped onto the porch, and immediately noticed his breath hanging in the air. Only 24 hours earlier the county had been baking beneath record-breaking heat. Now the thermometer beside the porch read 31 degrees Fahrenheit and continued dropping. He grabbed a flashlight and hurried into the orchard while Lily watched from the kitchen window, wrapping both hands around a mug of hot chocolate. The painted trunks reflected the pale beam of light, standing quietly beneath the fading stars. Marcus placed his hand against the bark of the nearest tree. It felt cool, but stable. He moved from tree to tree without rushing, checking every row exactly as his father had taught him years ago. Across the valley, dozens of irrigation pumps roared to life as growers desperately tried to protect their orchards from the sudden freeze. Water sprayed into the air, coating branches with a thin layer of ice intended to shield the delicate fruit. Pickup trucks raced between fields, Porch lights flickered on throughout the county as families woke earlier than usual, hoping experience and hard work would be enough. Ethan Walker stood in the middle of his vast orchard issuing calm instructions to his crew. He had managed difficult seasons before, and confidence still guided every decision. Yet as sunrise slowly painted the eastern sky, something unexpected became impossible to ignore. Thin cracks began appearing along the dark trunks of many untreated trees. They were small at first, barely noticeable beneath the rough bark, but each hour the changing temperatures stretched them farther. By midday, several workers quietly exchanged worried glances. The bark had absorbed days of intense heat before the freezing air arrived overnight. The rapid change was taking a toll that nobody had anticipated. Marcus remained inside his own orchard all morning, speaking very little. He trimmed one damaged twig here, adjusted a support stake there, then simply observed. The white coating covering every trunk reflected the bright sunlight instead of trapping it, keeping the bark far more stable through the dramatic weather swing. He had hoped his father had been right. Now he was beginning to believe it. Late that afternoon, Grace Turner drove into the driveway without calling first. She climbed out of her truck with concern written across her face. "Have you heard what is happening across the county?" she asked. Marcus nodded quietly. "Some orchards are already reporting serious bark damage." Grace looked beyond him toward the rows of painted trees. "Yours look different," she whispered, almost afraid to say the words aloud. Before Marcus could answer, another truck slowed beside the road. Then another. Farmers who had laughed only days earlier stood silently behind the fence, studying the orchard with expressions that no longer carried amusement. Nobody made jokes. Nobody smiled. They simply stared at row after row of healthy trunks glowing softly beneath the afternoon sun. Far across the valley, Ethan paused beside one of his oldest peach trees and rested his hand against a fresh crack running through the bark. For the first time all season, he stopped looking at his own orchard and turned his eyes toward Marcus Reed's hillside. The valley settled into an unfamiliar silence over the next several days. The frantic sound of irrigation pumps faded, replaced by quiet conversations spoken in lowered voices at feed stores, church parking lots, and roadside diners. Farmers who usually greeted spring with confident smiles now walked their orchards carrying notebooks instead of coffee cups, stopping every few feet to inspect bark that had begun splitting beneath the strain of the sudden weather swing. Marcus continued his routine without changing a single habit. Before sunrise, he brewed coffee, packed Lily's lunch, drove her to school, and returned home while a thin layer of morning mist drifted between the rows of peach trees. Every painted trunk reflected the soft golden light as though the orchard had awakened before the rest of the county. Marcus slowly ran his hand across the smooth white coating, feeling the cool surface beneath his fingertips. He was grateful, but he remained cautious. His father had always warned him that one good week never guaranteed a successful harvest. Nature rewarded patience, not celebration. That afternoon, Lily raced home carrying a folded drawing from school. She spread it across the kitchen table with an excited smile. She had colored a hillside covered with bright green peach trees, each trunk painted white beneath a blue spring sky. In the corner, she had written 4 simple words in careful handwriting. Grandpa knew the answer. Marcus stared quietly at the drawing before smiling in a way Lily had not seen in months. He carefully placed it inside the old leather notebook beside his father's weather charts. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The late afternoon sunlight spilled through the kitchen window, warming the worn wooden table where 3 generations of the Reed family had once shared meals together. Outside, a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh blossoms across the orchard, replacing the tension that had lingered since the first day of laughter. Grace Turner arrived just before sunset with a basket of homemade biscuits. She noticed the peaceful expression on Marcus's face and smiled. "You look different," she said softly. Marcus looked toward the orchard glowing beneath the fading light. "The trees are breathing again," he replied. Grace followed his gaze. Across the distant valley, she could also see patches of brown spreading through several neighboring orchards where damaged bark had begun slowing new growth. The contrast became more obvious each passing day. Marcus did not celebrate another farmer's hardship. Instead, he quietly loaded extra fertilizer bags onto his old trailer, planning to share supplies with anyone who needed them if shortages developed. Grace watched him without saying anything. She finally understood that the strength people admired in Marcus had never come from proving someone wrong. It came from refusing to let bitterness grow where kindness could still take root. As evening settled over the hills, Marcus and Lily walked slowly between the rows of healthy trees. Tiny peaches, no larger than marbles, swayed gently beneath the fresh green leaves. Lily slipped her small hand into her father's and looked up with hopeful eyes. "Do you think Mom can see this?" she whispered. Marcus looked toward the glowing horizon before answering in a calm voice. "I think she would be proud that we never stopped believing." Above them, the last rays of sunlight reflected softly from every white trunk, and somewhere beyond the quiet hillside, vehicles were already turning onto the county road again, but this time the people inside were not coming to laugh. Nearly 6 weeks later, the first full harvest inspection began beneath a bright blue Georgia sky. Pickup trucks rolled into the Reed farm before sunrise, but this time nobody arrived with laughter or raised phones searching for another joke. County agricultural inspectors, university horticulture specialists, and growers from neighboring farms stepped quietly through the orchard carrying clipboards, measuring tools, and cameras. Marcus greeted every visitor with the same calm smile he offered anyone who came through the gate. He answered questions without pride and without resentment, then returned to helping Lily fill wooden baskets with peaches that glowed deep shades of red and gold beneath the morning light. One professor from the University of Georgia paused beside a painted trunk and carefully measured its surface temperature before comparing it to several untreated trees from nearby orchards. He repeated the process again and again, writing detailed notes each time. Another specialist examined the bark beneath the white coating, gently brushing away a small section before looking back toward his colleagues with quiet surprise. None of them rushed to conclusions. They simply kept collecting evidence. Around noon, the visitors gathered beneath the shade of an old pecan tree where folding tables held samples from orchards across the county. Marcus stood beside Lily while the specialists reviewed their findings. Finally, the senior horticulturist removed his glasses and looked toward the assembled farmers. "The results are remarkably consistent," he said. "The reflective coating reduced heat stress on the bark during the extreme temperature swing. That lower temperature likely reduced cracking when the cold front arrived. The trees maintained healthier vascular tissue, resulting in stronger fruit development." Silence settled across the gathering. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Ethan Walker slowly stepped forward from the back of the crowd. His shoulders seemed heavier than Marcus remembered, not because he had lost his confidence, but because he had finally found humility. He looked across the orchard, then quietly admitted, "I spent 30 years believing experience meant I had already learned everything worth knowing." His voice softened. "I was wrong." Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into one of the harvest baskets, selected a perfectly ripe peach, and handed it to Ethan. "The trees do not care who was right," he said gently. "They only reward those willing to keep learning." Ethan accepted the fruit with both hands, unable to hide the emotion in his eyes. Around them, other growers exchanged uncertain glances before slowly walking toward the painted rows, asking questions that only weeks earlier they would have mocked. Lily watched the conversation unfold while standing beside her father. She noticed something that made her smile. The people who once pointed cameras at Marcus were now taking close-up photographs of the tree trunks instead of the man. Their attention had shifted from ridicule to curiosity. Grace Turner quietly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye as she watched neighbors gathering around Marcus with notebooks open, eager to understand the forgotten technique preserved inside one weathered leather journal. The afternoon sun drifted lower across the valley, reflecting softly from every white trunk. And for the first time since spring began, the entire county understood that wisdom could sometimes arrive from the smallest orchard, the quietest voice, and the father almost everyone had underestimated. Word spread far beyond the county before the harvest season ended. Farmers from neighboring towns began calling Marcus, asking whether they could visit the orchard and see the technique with their own eyes. Some drove more than 100 miles, carrying notebooks just as Marcus's father once had. Others arrived with quiet humility, admitting they had dismissed the idea without ever trying to understand it. Marcus welcomed every visitor exactly the same way. He walked them through each row, explained how the reflective coating protected the bark from sudden temperature swings, and carefully reminded everyone that no single method could replace respect for the land. He never claimed to have invented anything new. He simply honored knowledge that had nearly been forgotten. One crisp Saturday morning, Ethan Walker returned alone. There were no reporters, no neighbors, and no audience waiting to witness what happened next. He parked his truck beside the old farmhouse and stood silently near the gate until Marcus noticed him trimming a low branch. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Ethan removed his cap and held it against his chest. "I owe you more than an apology," he said quietly. "I laughed because I believed success meant I already had every answer. I forgot that pride can make a person stop learning." Marcus looked at him with the same calm expression he had carried since the first day of spring. "We all miss things sometimes," he replied. "The important part is what we choose to do after we see them." Ethan nodded slowly before asking the question he never imagined he would have to ask. "Would you teach me?" Marcus smiled gently. "Tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. Bring work clothes instead of opinions." For the first time in weeks, Ethan laughed, not at Marcus, but at himself. The next morning, as promised, he arrived before sunrise wearing old boots and faded jeans instead of expensive farm jackets. Side by side, the two men mixed fresh batches of white coating and began applying careful, even strokes to the trunks inside Ethan's damaged orchard. Lily carried small brushes for the younger replacement trees, happily explaining each step exactly as her father had shown her. Grace Turner watched from the roadside with quiet satisfaction as more neighbors gradually joined them, not because anyone ordered them to help, but because kindness had become more contagious than ridicule. The atmosphere felt completely different from the day Marcus had first painted his own orchard. There were no sarcastic remarks, no whispered jokes, and no phones searching for entertainment. Instead, conversations centered on weather patterns, soil health, and old farming practices worth preserving. Before leaving that afternoon, Ethan paused beside the weathered leather notebook resting on the farmhouse porch. "Your father would be proud," he said softly. Marcus looked toward the orchard where Lily was laughing while painting another young tree. He closed the notebook with gentle hands and answered, "He would be happier knowing the lesson did not stop with me." As the golden light settled across the valley, rows of freshly painted trunks began appearing beyond the Reed farm, one orchard after another, quietly proving that the strongest harvest of all had not been peaches, but humility shared from one neighbor to the next. A year passed, and spring returned to the valley with the same gentle sunrise that had greeted generations before it, but something had quietly changed. As Marcus drove Lily to school along the winding county road, she pressed her face against the truck window and smiled. Orchard after orchard stretched across the rolling hills, and nearly every peach tree now stood with bright white trunks glowing beneath the early morning light. The sight no longer seemed strange. It had become part of the landscape, accepted without question by the same community that once laughed at it. Marcus parked beside the school, and before Lily climbed out, she looked back toward the distant hills. "Daddy," she said softly, "they are all doing it now." Marcus followed her gaze for a long moment before smiling. "That is not the important part," he answered. "The important part is that the trees have a better chance because people were willing to learn." Lily nodded thoughtfully before running toward the school in trance with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Marcus waited until she disappeared inside, then quietly drove back toward the orchard. The farmhouse looked exactly as it always had. The old porch still creaked beneath every step. The weathered barn still leaned slightly to one side. Wildflowers still bloomed beside the fence where Angela had planted them years before. Some things never needed to change. Inside the farmhouse, Marcus opened the leather notebook one more time. Its pages had grown even softer with age, carrying fingerprints from 3 generations of careful hands. Tucked between the weather charts and handwritten notes remained Lily's drawing of the white orchard, the simple picture she had made after the storm. Marcus smiled gently before adding one final page at the back of the notebook. He did not write about proving anyone wrong. He did not mention the newspaper stories, the university visitors, or the record harvest. Instead, he wrote a single sentence beneath his father's faded handwriting. "Wisdom only survives when it is shared with kindness." He closed the notebook and placed it back on the same workbench where it had rested for decades. Outside, Ethan Walker's truck slowly pulled into the driveway. This time he did not come asking questions. He came carrying a basket filled with peaches from his recovered orchard. Grace Turner arrived a few minutes later with fresh biscuits still warm from the oven. Soon several neighbors gathered beneath the old pecan tree, sharing stories, recipes, and plans for the next growing season. There were no speeches, no grand celebrations, and no reminders of the day. Laughter had echoed across the road. Those moments had quietly faded, replaced by something far more lasting. As evening settled over the valley, golden light washed across thousands of white tree trunks stretching toward the horizon like silent reminders that truth does not need to shout to be heard. Marcus stood beside Lily at the edge of the orchard while a gentle breeze carried the scent of blossoms through the air. Neither of them spoke. They simply watched the sunlight fade across the hills, knowing that the greatest harvest had never been measured in bushels of peaches, but in the hearts willing to replace pride with humility, judgment with understanding, and doubt with quiet compassion.